Arizona Territory, 1885. The unforgiving sun beat down on the dusty town of Copper Creek, where the promise of silver had drawn the desperate and the determined alike. The frontier was where dreams either flourished or perished beneath the merciless western sky, and 25-year-old Dawson Xavier had long ago decided that love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. The young cowboy adjusted his worn Stetson, shielding eyes the color of a summer storm from the glare, as he guided his chestnut gelding down the main street. His lean frame carried the wiry strength of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, and though only 25, the set of his jaw spoke of hardships that had aged him beyond his years. "A man's gotta look after himself out here," he muttered to his horse, a habit formed during long, lonely cattle drives. "Ain't nobody else gonna do it." Dawson had learned that lesson the hard way. 3 years earlier, he'd watched helplessly as outlaws gunned down his father and brother over a handful of cattle. Since then, he'd kept to himself, drifting between ranches, taking work where he could find it. The scars on his heart had hardened into an unshakable belief. Attachment was dangerous in a land where death rode beside every man. What Dawson wanted was straightforward enough, to earn enough money to buy his own spread someday, somewhere far from people and their complications. What he needed, though he would have denied it fiercely, was to fill the hollowness that echoed inside him with every passing season. Reining in before the general store, Dawson dismounted and looped his reins around the hitching post. He needed supplies before heading to the Broken Spoke Ranch, where he'd hired on for the season. His boot had barely touched the weathered boardwalk when the commotion erupted down the street. "Thief! Stop him!" Dawson's head snapped up to see a man in a filthy duster sprinting his way, clutching something to his chest. Behind him, a young woman gave chase, her honey-blonde hair streaming from beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her blue riding skirt hitched up as she ran with surprising speed. Acting on instinct, Dawson stepped directly into the thief's path. The collision sent both men sprawling in the dirt. Dawson recovered first, pinning the struggling man with one knee while wresting a small leather pouch from his grimy fingers. "I believe this ain't yours," Dawson growled, hauling the thief to his feet just as the town marshal appeared. "I'll take him from here," the lawman said, gripping the cursing thief by his collar. Only then did Dawson turn to face the owner of the stolen pouch. His breath caught. Standing before him, slightly winded but with fire in her eyes, was perhaps the most striking woman he'd ever encountered. At 22, she had the fresh-faced beauty of youth combined with a confidence that most frontier women twice her age rarely possessed. Her honey-blonde hair framed features that were delicate yet determined, and her riding clothes, practical but well-made, suggested a woman accustomed to working on horseback. "Thank you kindly," she said, extending her hand. "That contains this month's payroll for my ranch hands. I'm Penelope Eastwood." Dawson hesitated before taking her hand, surprised by the calluses that met his palm. "Dawson Xavier. Just happened to be in the right place." "Well, Mr. Xavier, your timing was fortunate. That thief nearly made off with everything my ranch earned this month." Her steady gaze held his, neither timid nor flirtatious, but direct. "May I buy you a meal to show my gratitude? The Copper Creek Hotel serves a decent steak." Every instinct told Dawson to decline, get supplies, ride out, stay unattached, but something about Penelope Eastwood made him pause. "I suppose I could eat," he found himself saying. That meal would change everything Dawson believed about his place in the frontier world. Over plates of beefsteak and potatoes, Dawson learned that Penelope Penny, as she insisted he call her, ran the Crescent E Ranch 5 miles outside of town. She'd inherited it from her father 2 years ago when he succumbed to pneumonia, and despite predictions that she'd sell out, she not only kept the ranch running but had expanded its operations. "People expect me to fail," she said, a flash of steel in her green eyes. "They're waiting for the day I come crawling to them, begging to be rescued by marriage or a buyout offer." "And you don't aim to give them the satisfaction," Dawson observed. Her smile was quick and genuine. "No, sir, I do not. The Crescent E is my home and my legacy. I've spent every day proving a woman can run a ranch as well as any man." "Seems to me you're doing just that," Dawson replied, surprised to find admiration replacing his usual caution around strangers. Penny tilted her head, studying him. "You're not from around here, passing through." "Headed to the Broken Spoke, hired on for the season." Something flashed across her face. The Broken Spoke. "Henderson's place." Dawson nodded, fork paused halfway to his mouth at her sudden change in demeanor. "Problem with that?" Penny lowered her voice. Just be careful, Mr. Xavier. James Henderson has a reputation for underpaying his hands and working them half to death. He's also not above moving boundary markers when it suits him. I've worked for worse, Dawson shrugged, though the warning settled uneasily in his gut. A job's a job. Well, if you find the conditions not to your liking, Penny said carefully, the Crescent E could use another experienced hand, especially with Roundup coming. Dawson nearly refused outright. Working for a woman, especially one like Penny Eastwood, would mean entanglements, complications, everything he'd avoided since burying his family. I'll keep it in mind, he said instead, knowing he wouldn't. They parted ways outside the hotel, Dawson heading to the general store while Penny went to speak with the banker. He told himself he'd likely never see her again, that their paths had crossed briefly and would now diverge for good. 3 days later, Dawson discovered how wrong he was. The Broken Spoke Ranch proved every bit as miserable as Penny had warned. Henderson was a hard man with cold eyes who worked his hands from well before dawn until long after dusk. The bunkhouse leaked when it rained, the food was barely edible, and the pay would be doled out at the end of the month if Henderson deemed the work satisfactory. Dawson might have endured it all if not for what he witnessed on his 4th morning. He'd been sent to check the eastern boundary fence and found Henderson and 2 of his men moving a line of stone markers further onto neighboring land that Dawson recognized from Penny's description as belonging to the Crescent E. What's going on here? Dawson asked, reining his horse to a stop beside the men. Henderson straightened, wiping sweat from his balding pate. Just correcting a surveying error, Xavier. This has always been Broken Spoke land. The lie hung between them, transparent in the morning light. Seems to me the markers were just fine where they were, Dawson replied evenly. Henderson's face hardened. You're paid to work, not think. Get back to that fence line. Dawson sat his horse for a long moment, weighing his options. He needed this job, but not at the cost of his integrity. I reckon I'll be moving on instead. You can keep these 3 days' wages. You walk off my land now, you'll not find work at any ranch in this territory, Henderson threatened, his hand dropping to the revolver on his hip. Dawson didn't flinch. Maybe. Maybe not. He turned his horse and rode away, feeling Henderson's glare burning into his back. By midday, he found himself approaching the gate of the Crescent E, a decision he hadn't consciously made until he was already halfway there. Penny was in the corral, working with a spirited pinto when he rode in. She looked up, surprise quickly giving way to understanding as she took in his expression. Henderson showed his true colors, I take it, she called, handing the horse off to a ranch hand before walking to meet him. You might want to check your eastern boundary, Dawson replied by way of answer. Seems some markers have gone walkabout. Anger flashed in her eyes. Again, that's the 3rd time this year. Dawson dismounted, suddenly feeling awkward. I was wondering if that job offer still stood. Penny's smile returned, warming her features. It does, though I should warn you, I pay fair wages, but I expect honest work. And I won't have fighting among my hands. Yes, ma'am, Dawson replied, trying to ignore the strange flutter in his chest at the prospect of working for her. Good, bunkhouse is over yonder. Get settled and find Hank, my foreman. He'll put you to work. She paused, then added softly, I'm glad you came, Dawson. Those simple words stayed with him as he made his way to the bunkhouse. For the first time in years, someone was glad of his presence. The thought was as unsettling as it was warming. The Crescent E proved to be everything the Broken Spoke wasn't. The work was hard but fair, the men competent and mostly friendly, and Penny was a demanding but respected boss who worked alongside her hands when needed. Dawson found himself gradually letting down his guard, especially around her. They fell into an easy routine of sharing coffee at dawn before the day's work began. Penny would outline what needed doing, seeking his input when appropriate. Those quiet moments, with steam rising from their cups as the sun painted the eastern sky, became something Dawson found himself looking forward to with unexpected eagerness. A month into his employment, Penny approached him after supper. Ride with me tomorrow, she said. I need to check the high pasture, and Henderson's been spotted near our north section. Dawson nodded, ignoring the knowing looks from the other hands. The men had been casting sidelong glances his way for weeks, clearly noticing the way their boss sought out his company. Dawson told himself it was merely Penny recognizing his experience, nothing more. The next morning broke clear and cool. a perfect early summer day for a long ride. They set out at dawn, Penny leading the way up a narrow trail that wound through stands of ponderosa pine. She rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, her blonde hair braided and tucked beneath her hat. "My father taught me to ride before I could walk," she explained when Dawson commented on her skill. Said a rancher who couldn't outride their hands wasn't fit to give orders. Sounds like a wise man. He was, a shadow crossed her face. He'd worked his whole life for this place, built it from nothing after the war. When he died, everyone expected me to sell out to Henderson, even had the papers drawn up, thinking I'd be too grief-stricken to refuse. "But you proved them wrong," Dawson observed. "I'm still proving them wrong," she glanced sideways at him. "What about you, Dawson? You've never mentioned family." The question struck like a physical blow, reopening wounds he'd thought scarred over. For a moment he considered deflecting, as he always did, but something about the quiet morning and Penny's steady presence loosened his tongue. "Had a family once," he said gruffly. "Father, younger brother. We ran a small spread in Texas. Nothing fancy, but it was ours." He paused, memories surging. 3 years back, rustlers hit us. Pa and Jack tried to stop them. I was checking fence lines miles away. By the time I got back..." "I'm sorry," Penny said softly when he couldn't continue. "Been drifting since. Figured it was safer that way." "Safer for whom?" The simple question caught him off guard. "For everyone, I suppose. Man gets attached to people, to places, it just gives fate more targets." Penny reined her horse to a stop, turning in the saddle to face him fully. "That's a lonely way to live, Dawson Xavier." "Better lonely than heartbroken again," he replied, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Is it?" Her gaze held his, challenging yet compassionate. "My father used to say that a heart that never breaks never truly lives." Before Dawson could formulate a response, a distant gunshot echoed across the valley. Both their heads snapped toward the sound. "That came from the north pasture," Penny said, her expression hardening, "where Henderson's been sniffing around." Without another word, they spurred their horses forward, the conversation forgotten as they raced toward potential trouble. They crested a ridge to see 3 riders herding a small group of Crescent-y cattle toward a narrow pass that would take them off Penny's land. "Henderson's men," Penny spat, recognizing the broken spoke brand on their horses. She drew the rifle from her scabbard in one fluid motion. "I've had enough of this." "Wait," Dawson cautioned, placing a restraining hand on her arm. 3 against 2 are poor odds." "So what do you suggest?" "Let them steal my cattle while we ride back for help." "No," Dawson replied, eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. "We split up. You circle around through that stand of trees. I'll approach from this side. We can catch them in a crossfire, not to kill, but to persuade them this theft isn't worth their trouble." Penny hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Be careful, Dawson." "Always am," he replied with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Watching her ride away, he was struck by the realization that for the first time in years, he was genuinely worried about someone other than himself. The plan worked better than either could have hoped. Caught between Dawson's accurate rifle shots sending dirt spitting at their horses' hooves and Penny's commanding presence as she emerged from the trees, the rustlers quickly abandoned their theft and fled. "That'll give Henderson something to think about," Penny said as they regathered the scattered cattle, "though I doubt it's the last we'll see of his attempts." "Probably not," Dawson agreed, scanning the horizon for any sign the rustlers might return with reinforcements. "A man like that doesn't give up easy." "Neither do I," Penny replied, determination hardening her features. Then unexpectedly her expression softened. "We make a good team, you and I." The simple statement caught Dawson off guard, stirring feelings he'd been trying to ignore since their first meeting. Working alongside Penny these past weeks had slowly chipped away at the walls he'd built around his heart. Her strength, her dedication, her unwillingness to back down, all qualities that both impressed and unsettled him. "Just doing my job," he muttered, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her gaze. Penny studied him for a long moment. "Is that all it is, Dawson, a job?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Before Dawson could answer, a distant rumble of thunder broke the tension. "Storm's coming," he said, grateful for the distraction. "We should get these cattle back." The ride back to the ranch was conducted in a silence broken only by the occasional directions to the cattle and the growing rumble of thunder. By the time they reached the crescent fat droplets of rain were beginning to fall, and the sky had darkened ominously. "Get inside before you're soaked through," Penny ordered as they dismounted in the ranch yard. "I'll see to the horses." "I can help," Dawson began, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. "You've done enough today. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I need time to think." Watching her lead both horses toward the stable, Dawson felt a confusing mix of relief and disappointment. He'd come dangerously close to admitting feelings he scarcely understood himself, feelings that contradicted everything he'd believed about surviving on the frontier. The storm intensified overnight, turning into one of those rare summer tempests that transformed dry creek beds into raging torrents and tested the sturdiest structures. Dawson lay awake in the bunkhouse, listening to the rain hammer the roof and the wind howl around the corners, his thoughts as turbulent as the weather outside. Dawn brought clearing skies but revealed substantial damage across the ranch. Fences down and outbuildings' roof partially collapsed, and worst of all, the creek that supplied water to the main pastures had jumped its banks, washing out the earthen dam that controlled its flow. "Without that dam, half our grazing land will be too dry by August," Penny explained to the assembled ranch hands after surveying the damage. "Rebuilding it is our first priority." The work was backbreaking, hauling stones, diverting the still-swollen creek, mixing mud and straw to seal the new dam. Everyone worked from sunrise to sunset, Penny alongside her men, her face streaked with mud, her hands as blistered as any of theirs. 3 days into the repairs, disaster struck again. A section of partially completed dam collapsed suddenly, sending a wall of water and debris downstream. Dawson, working in the creek bed, had only seconds to react. "Look out," he shouted to the 2 men working beside him. They scrambled up the bank just in time. Penny wasn't as fortunate. Standing thigh-deep in the water downstream, she looked up at Dawson's warning cry just as the flood reached her. The force knocked her off her feet, sweeping her away in a churning mass of water and debris. Without hesitation, Dawson plunged into the creek, fighting the current as he pursued her. Terror such as he hadn't felt since finding his family's bodies gripped him. The thought of losing Penny, vibrant, determined Penny, was suddenly unbearable. He caught glimpses of her blonde hair as she struggled to keep her head above water. The creek curved sharply ahead, where a fallen tree created a dangerous strainer. Water could pass through, but anything larger would be trapped against it, held underwater by the relentless current. "Penny," Dawson shouted, driving his body harder, ignoring the branches and rocks that battered him. "Grab anything you can." Whether she heard him or acted on instinct, Penny managed to catch hold of a protruding root along the bank, momentarily halting her progress toward the deadly strainer. Dawson reached her seconds later, gripping her arm with desperate strength. "Hold on," he gasped, bracing himself against the creek bed as the current tried to tear them both away. "I've got you." Together they fought their way to the bank, collapsing on solid ground as the other ranch hands arrived, shouting questions and offers of help. Dawson was aware only of Penny beside him, coughing up creek water, her sodden clothes clinging to her shivering form. He pulled her against him, heedless of their audience, an unfamiliar prayer of thanks tumbling from his lips. "You saved my life," Penny whispered when she could speak, her voice ragged. "Couldn't let you drown," Dawson replied simply. "The ranch needs you." She pulled back slightly to look at him, her green eyes searching his face. "Just the ranch?" The question laid bare everything they'd been circling around for weeks. Dawson looked at this woman, soaked, muddy, and more beautiful to him than anyone had ever been, and felt the last of his carefully constructed defenses crumble. "No," he admitted hoarsely, "not just the ranch." That evening, after Penny had changed into dry clothes, and the ranch hands had been reassured their boss was unharmed, she sought Dawson out in the barn where he was brushing down his horse, a task he found calming after the day's chaos. "We need to talk about what happened," she said without preamble. Dawson's hands stilled on the brush. "Which part, the dam breaking, you nearly drowning, or what I said afterward?" "All of it." Penny moved closer, into the pool of lantern light. "But mostly the last part." Dawson set the brush aside and turned to face her fully. "I meant what I said, Penny. It's not just the ranch that needs you." "And what exactly do you need me for, Dawson Xavier?" The directness of her question was so typically Penny that he couldn't help but smile despite his nervousness. To remind me that there's more to living than just surviving, that the frontier doesn't have to be faced alone. Is that all? She pressed, taking another step closer. Dawson swallowed hard, knowing he stood at a crossroads. Behind him lay the safety of emotional isolation, ahead the terrifying possibility of love and loss. For 3 years the choice had been simple. Now, looking into Penny's expectant face, it no longer was. "No," he said finally. "That's not all. I need you because somehow, without meaning to, I've fallen in love with you, Penelope Eastwood, and it scares me half to death." The barn fell silent save for the soft nickering of horses and the distant howl of a coyote. Penny stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. "It should scare you," she said at last. "Love is the most dangerous thing on the frontier. More dangerous than outlaws or storms or rustlers." She closed the remaining distance between them. "And yet, it's the only thing that makes any of those dangers worth facing." Before Dawson could respond, she reached up and pulled his head down to hers, pressing her lips against his in a kiss that started gentle but quickly blazed into something more urgent, more demanding. He wrapped his arms around her waist, drawing her closer, the feel of her against him more intoxicating than any whiskey. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Penny smiled up at him. "In case it wasn't clear, Dawson Xavier, I've fallen in love with you too." The admission should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a warmth he hadn't experienced since before his family's deaths. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, a future with Penny beside him. "So what happens now?" he asked, his hands still resting on her waist. "Now," she replied with characteristic practicality, "we rebuild the dam. After that, we figure out the rest together." Dawson laughed, the sound strange to his own ears after so long. "Yes, ma'am." The next morning, word arrived that changed everything. A writer from town brought news that James Henderson had been arrested for land fraud and cattle rustling. The territorial marshal had been building a case against him for months, and now he was being transported to Yuma to stand trial. "This changes things," Penny said as they stood on the porch, watching the messenger ride away. "Without Henderson causing trouble, we might actually have a peaceful summer." "Don't count on it," Dawson cautioned. "The frontier always has surprises." He was right, though not in the way either expected. A week later, as the rebuilt dam neared completion, another rider approached the Crescent E, a weathered man in his 50s with a deputy marshal's badge pinned to his vest. "I'm looking for Dawson Xavier," he announced to the ranch hands who met him. Dawson stepped forward, wiping his hands on his pants. "That's me." The deputy sized him up. "Got some news you might want to hear, son. Those rustlers who killed your family 3 years back, we caught 'em last month over in New Mexico territory." The world seemed to tilt beneath Dawson's feet. "You're certain it's them?" "Caught 'em red-handed with stolen cattle. Once in custody, they started confessing to old crimes, hoping for leniency. Described your family's ranch down to the crooked chimney on the cabin." The deputy paused. "They'll hang come September." The news Dawson had both yearned for and given up hoping to hear left him speechless. Penny stepped to his side, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. "Thank you for bringing word," she told the deputy. "Will you stay for a meal before riding back?" The deputy accepted, and as he shared more details about the capture over coffee, Dawson sat in stunned silence. The men who had destroyed his world would face justice. The driving force that had kept him moving, kept him isolated, was suddenly gone. "Are you all right?" Penny asked softly when the deputy had departed. Dawson stared into the distance, his emotions too tangled to name. "I don't know," he admitted. "For so long, the thought of those men going unpunished kept me angry, kept me moving. Now you can finally lay your family to rest," Penny finished gently. "And maybe put down roots of your own." The suggestion hung between them, weighty with possibility. Dawson turned to study her face, seeing in it everything he'd denied himself for years: home, belonging, love. "I wouldn't know where to start," he said honestly. Penny's smile held both tenderness and challenge. "I might have some ideas about that." Those ideas became reality over the coming weeks. With the dam completed and Henderson no longer a threat, the Crescent E flourished under their combined management. Dawson's experience complemented Penny's innovative thinking, and the ranch hands soon grew accustomed to taking orders from both of them. Their courtship progressed in the practical manner of frontier folk who understood that life was too uncertain for lengthy engagements. By August, when Penny suggested they ride into Copper Creek to speak with the minister, Dawson was ready with his answer. "Not yet," he said, surprising her. "There's something I need to do first." A week later, they stood together in a small cemetery in Texas, Dawson kneeling before two simple wooden crosses as Penny waited respectfully nearby. He had never properly mourned his family, too consumed with anger and the need to keep moving. Now, with Penny's quiet support, he finally said goodbye. "I'm going to be all right now," he told the graves, his voice steady despite the tears tracking silently down his cheeks. "I found someone who reminds me what it means to live instead of just survive. I think you'd like her, Pa Jack. You'd probably tease me something awful about being sweet on the boss lady." He felt Penny's hand on his shoulder, a warm anchor bringing him back to the present. "I'll always miss you," he continued, "but I'm done running from happiness because I'm afraid of losing it again." Rising to his feet, Dawson took Penny's hand in his. "Thank you for coming with me." "Always," she replied simply. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Copper Creek, with the entire ranch in attendance. Penny wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her more slender frame, with wildflowers in her blonde hair. Dawson, scrubbed clean and nervous in a new suit, watched her walk toward him with wonder, still scarcely believing this strong, beautiful woman had chosen him. "You look like you're facing a firing squad," she whispered as she reached his side. "Feels about as terrifying," he admitted with a small smile. The ceremony was brief, frontier practical, but no less meaningful for its simplicity. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Dawson kissed his bride to the cheers and whistles of the ranch hands, he felt the last shadows of his past finally recede. The Crescent E became the Xavier Eastwood Ranch, though most still called it the Crescent E for simplicity's sake. Under their joint management, it prospered beyond even Penny's ambitious dreams. They added acreage, improved their stock, and built a new, larger ranch house with a wide porch where they could watch the sun set over their land. A year after their wedding, their first child arrived, a daughter with her mother's blonde hair and her father's storm-gray eyes. They named her Hope, a testament to what they'd found in each other against all odds. "She's perfect," Dawson whispered, cradling his newborn daughter with awe and terror in equal measure. "How do we protect her in a world this wild?" Penny, tired but radiant, smiled up at him from their bed, "The same way we've faced everything else together." As twilight settled over the ranch, Dawson sat on the porch with his daughter sleeping against his chest and his wife's hand clasped in his. In the distance, a coyote called, a reminder that the frontier remained wild, unpredictable, dangerous. But for the first time since losing his family, Dawson felt no urge to run, no need to protect himself through isolation. The frontier had taken much from him, but it had also given him Penny, hope, and the knowledge that love, far from being a luxury he couldn't afford, was the very thing that made surviving worthwhile. "Penny," he said quietly, "do you ever think about how unlikely all this was? A drifting cowboy with no future plans beyond the next season's work, a determined woman running a ranch against all odds." "Unlikely, maybe," she replied, squeezing his hand. "But not impossible, not once we both stopped fighting against what we needed most." Dawson nodded, understanding completely. What he'd thought he wanted, isolation, independence, freedom from attachment, had been nothing but a shield against pain. What he'd truly needed was precisely what he now held. Family, home, purpose, and the love of a woman strong enough to face the frontier beside him. The unexpected romance between the cowgirl and the cowboy had indeed changed their lives, transforming two souls wounded by the harsh realities of the West into something stronger together than either could have been alone. And as the stars appeared one by one above their home, Dawson Xavier finally embraced the truth he'd run from for so long, that even in the wildest places, especially in the wildest places, love was worth the risk.